present to this audience. But as here explained, one of the really most powerful elements to Anonymous is how they pushed against the culture of celebrity, individuality, and did so in a moment where these elements of celebrity culture, which have long existed, just became particularly powerful on social media. But I'm not going to talk about the dynamics of how they push against celebrity culture. Today, I've written about it. I've also had to defend anonymity, which I did in the epilogue of the book. But what I actually wanted to do today is precisely talk about how Anonymous, I think, was very well positioned to be framed as cyber terrorists, and they evaded that designation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And the reason why that's important, I think, is just inherently interesting, because I think a lot of political groups can fall to that frame. But precisely this message of anti-celebrity could never have been broadcast if they had been tagged cyber terrorists. So that's in some ways why I'm bringing this to the table here today. So there have been many different words I've used to describe Anonymous. They include hydra, trickster, confusing, enchanting, being very committed to a kind of anti-celebrity, anti-surveillance ethic, controversial, irreverent, interesting, unpredictable, frustrating, stupid, and wondrous, right? But one of the things that I never had to do was fight against the idea that they were terrorists. That is something that I kind of expected, but never really happened. So what I'm going to do today is, first of all, give you small bits of proof that they escaped this designation. Then I'm going to talk about why it was conceivable for them to be painted and smeared with the terrorism label, and then why they evaded it. Now, the story about how they evaded the label, because there were attempts made, has many different parts. But the part I'm going to focus in on the most today has to do with the Guy Fawkes icon and the Guy Fawkes mask. And it's a kind of really fascinating, complicated story, and I'm missing some historical bits, but it's a crucial part to this story. All right, so let's start with signs that they were not associated with terrorism or terrorists. So one of the most strongest kind of nuggets of proof is that most news articles, at least in the English-speaking world, referred to them as hacktivists, not as terrorists. There's a few exceptions, but really they were the marginal cases. And this doesn't mean that they were always painted in a positive way, but basically the T word was not really used very often. So that's one bit of proof. Another bit of proof is both proof that they weren't labeled as terrorists and helped to inoculate them against this charge. And it has to do with the massive adoption of anonymous or anonymous-like tropes in pop culture. And I'm going to show more later, but I'm just going to right now give you two examples. So Mr. Robot in the United States is probably the most famous, where a lot of the imagery and in fact even some of the particular cases of the anonymous world were picked up by the show. Now this is Hollywood, and now I'm going to give you another example, which comes from a kind of more niche cultural world, which also shows you how the hacktivist has been lauded and not kind of tagged as a terrorist. So I'm just going to play the video.
Do you meet kids, young people today who have that same irreverent sense of humor? And how have they changed?
I think they're having just as much fun being beta as I did in the 60s. I don't think that we had more fun when they did it. It's still, if you're a rebel today, you're sitting, you live with your parents, they haven't seen you in 6 months, they put food outside your bedroom door, and you're shutting down the government. That's how you rebel today. You'd be a hacker.
Yeah.
And I would say, I don't want a hacker boyfriend, except I have beta posture.
Okay. And so later on, I'm going to give you more examples of the hacktivist or anonymous being adopted as a kind of icon of a rebellious figure. So now, why could they have been vilified? I'm going to go through this rather quickly, because I think some of these are pretty obvious. First of all, as we all know, the terrorism label has been used past and present very liberally to constrain and disable political movements and individuals. It includes, this book is quite good in this regard, but it includes historical cases such as Nelson Mandela, who'd been labeled as a terrorist in the UK and the United States. The designation was eventually dropped, but very recently. This is not just a US phenomena or a British phenomena, it happens all over Europe. To take a recent example, there's a group called the Tarnac 9, which engaged in acts of sabotage to stop the train system in France, but there was no loss of life. They have been accused of being terrorists under the law. In the United States, there was certain police organizations that claimed Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization. There was a petition that reached 100,000 signatures, which claimed Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization. Now, many of these recent cases, Black Lives Matter, there's also Spanish puppeteers were kind of accused of being terrorists, have not stuck. But the case in the United States, which has not necessarily stuck in the public mind, but environmental rights activists, especially animal rights activists, have been labeled by the press and literally by the law as terrorists. So there was a change in the law that basically labeled what they did as acts of terrorism. And this is something that has been going on for a while. And a book by Will Potter, Green is the New Red, really documents this transformation where monkey wrencher saboteur are now the same as terrorists. And it is, again, something that you could even see in news articles as well. Now, another kind of reason why Anonymous could be painted as cyber terrorists is that there's been a long-standing cyber warfare frame, which basically claims that right around the corner is cyber Pearl Harbor, where there's going to be a terrible infrastructural attack that's going to lead to loss of life. And interestingly enough, this frame, although it was really used quite liberally in the 2000s, existed since the early 1990s, and this was a report from 1991, which says the modern thief can steal more with a computer than with a gun. Tomorrow's terrorist may be able to do more damage with a keyboard than with a bomb. And I really actually did think that between this and then the fact that there was a lot of really high-risk hacking and sabotage within Anonymous, that this might have been enough. And I'm going to quote Cory Doctorow, who described the hacking in Anonymous in the following way. And the kind of hacking that Anonymous does by means of the fluid, structureless norms of the group, half macho posturing, half uber-savvy media prankstership, is doubly exciting, or exciting squared. It is filled with drama, betrayals, police informants, intimidation, brinkmanship, insane risk-taking, and impassioned speeches from the battlements. It's groups like LulzSec and AntiSec who were hacking entities like NATO, right? I mean, this was really a big deal at the height of their operations. They were telling the FBI to fuck off as well, which is a big challenge to the FBI. So this alone, I think, could have put them in a position to sort of be vilified. But the next example of why it was possible was because there were actual attempts made to label them as terrorists. And I'm not going to go through all of them. There were, kind of a handful, but the one that I found most interesting is the following one. I'm going to return to this later. But there was a Wall Street Journal article that was published in 2012 that claimed the following. The director of the National Security Agency has warned that the hacking group Anonymous would have the ability within the next year or two to bring about a limited power outage through a cyber attack. Now, this isn't, directly saying they're terrorists, but sort of by putting it out there in people's minds that they would go after critical infrastructure, it kind of seeded the idea that they were extremists. And it's kind of a crazy article because it really was based on no proof. And again, I'm going to go back to it a little bit later. So, why did the attempts fail? Again, the story has many different vectors. And I'm going to cover what I see as the 5 most important ones, but give a little bit more attention to 1 or 2 of the examples. One has to do with timing and who and what Anonymous supported in its early activist history. So for a period of time when Anonymous first started to engage in political organizing and activism, it was really identified with internet-y things and movements. But in 2012, they got involved in every single one of the kind of social movements that were rocking the world. And I think this was really important because, sorry about that. This was really important because, these movements generally weren't identified with terrorism. In some of them, like Occupy, they were quite identified with Anonymous. So this kind of allowed them to receive the positive associations that came with these social movements. Kind of related to this has to do with Anonymous's flexibility and coherence, depending on how you see it. So if you take something like the animal rights activists, they're doing one thing and one thing alone, which is liberating animals. They really have only one look and feel to them. Whereas Anonymous operates along a very different logic. One of the speakers tomorrow, Marco, has written a wonderful book about the multiple use name, which is a phenomenon where a certain alias, such as Luther Blissett, which was popular here in Italy and Europe, a name taken by different activists across Europe to organize pranks and campaigns, or Captain Swing, different groups of people use the name for different purposes. And Anonymous is like a multiple use name on steroids, right? Insofar as the name was taken globally from Malaysia to India to engage in all sorts of campaigns. And just to give you one surprising example, they got really involved in fighting rape culture in the United States. They got involved in animal rights activism, in police brutality campaigns, in anti-capitalist campaigns, and free speech campaigns. And very different types of groups use the name. And so with all this kind of flurry of activity, it becomes a little bit harder to designate it as a kind of single thing. So that too helped inoculate it against the terrorism charge. Again, this is just to show that they were really taken up globally in very different types of places. All right, so now I want to talk about this, the adoption of the Guy Fawkes mask. A lot of people think that Anonymous took the mask kind of deliberately and has always used this icon, whereas in fact, they really adopted the mask by mistake a little bit. So when Anonymous was organizing its first street protests against the Church of Scientology in 2008, they were going to show up in front of Scientology churches, and they knew that the Church of Scientology, the members would take high-definition photos. So they're like, hey, let's use the Guy Fawkes mask because it's cool, and we could all, order it online. And lo and behold, thousands of people showed up in front of these churches with this mask. So it was a bit of an accident, but it was a really helpful icon to adopt to kind of prevent this frame of terrorism. And the reason why I love this example is because for most of for most of history, Guy Fawkes, or not most, but for a few hundred years, Guy Fawkes, who tried to blow up the British Parliament on behalf of the Catholics, and he failed, for most of British history, or a good part of it, he was considered like a really nasty figure. And the 5th of November was to commemorate how horrible he was, and sort of have that be a kind of state ritual which would honor and commemorate state power. Now we know that the figure of Guy Fawkes and the associations changed quite a bit over time, and the apex of that change came with V for Vendetta, which was a graphic novel and then a Hollywood movie, and the original graphic novel was written by Alan Moore. But what's fascinating, and now I'm going to show you a quote by Alan Moore, is that this transformation of Guy Fawkes from like a kind of terrible terrorist figure to an ambivalent revolutionary icon occurred much earlier. And I'm going to now just quote something from Alan Moore, who wrote something about it in the BBC. He said, "As mastermind behind the terrorist outrage du jour, however, the plot's nominal leader, Guido Fawkes, rapidly replaced the pontiff as hate mascot of choice on these occasions. Jump forward 300 years, though, to the battered post-war England of the 1950s, and the saturnine insurrectionary had taken on more ambiguous connotations. When parents explained to their offspring about Guy Fawkes and his attempt to blow up Parliament, there always seemed to be an undertone of admiration in their voices, or at least there did in Northampton. While that era's children perhaps didn't see Fawkes as a hero, they certainly didn't see him as the villainous scapegoat he had originally intended to be." Now, what helped usher in this transformation? Well, in fact, in the 1850s, novelists and children's books writers started to use Guy Fawkes as an icon and present him as a kind of ambivalent hero, anti-hero. Guy Fawkes, or the Gunpowder Treason, is kind of the first book that started to do this. I've actually read it, and it's really kind of boring. And subsequently, a lot of children's books were also created. Now, I think, and this is the missing historical piece, one of the fascinating things is that when Guy Fawkes was burned at the stake as an effigy, masks were sold in order to get the mask, in order to put it on something to burn. But I think that there's something about the fact that a mask was used that people could put on themselves that also kind of helped that transference at some level. And anyone who's seen V for Vendetta knows just how powerful the mask as a kind of object to, efface the self and become a new person is, right? And so at the end of V for Vendetta, it ends this way. 1 year after Parliament is demolished, V destroys the eye, ear, mouth, allowing the citizens of Britain the freedom to do whatever they wish. V dies while attempting to destroy Downing Street, an act that Evie completes. She then assumes the mask, costume, and the role of her mentor, V. And again, the reason why I'm using this quote is both to show the transference that can happen with a mask, and then also just to go back to this graphic novel and film, because I really do think that this film in particular played a really important role in kind of putting that cherry on top of ensuring that Guy Fawkes would be seen as a kind of more powerful figure. But then those positive associations became even more positive when Anonymous started to use this mask in a moment of history where the government represented in Britain started to match reality, right? So what was represented in film is sort of like, wow, actually that really does capture our present and doesn't even seem like fiction in any way. And what's also fascinating is that while Anonymous became very famous for their hacktivism, for their hacking, I think it was really important that there were a lot of street protests with the visual presence of these individuals with the masks for many different reasons. It just really embodied that collective we, right? Which is a little bit hard to visualize on the internet. And then again, there's this weird way in which all of a sudden the reality of these protests seemed to be imitating a movie and graphic novel, which was imitating history. And there's this amazing kind of cycle that has gone on. And actually, when I write about this, this is what I want to mostly focus in on. Now, related to this cycle is if Anonymous in some ways was imitating fiction that was imitating reality, now we have new forms of fiction that have taken on Anonymous and the Guy Fawkes mask. And I've collected like as many as I could find, and there's many, many references to Anonymous, many of which integrate the mask. Probably the best one is this great German film made by these Swedes called Who Am I? No System is Safe. And it's a group called Clay who use a mask, and it's so clearly modeled on Anonymous. It has showed up in kind of movies you wouldn't expect, such as Dope, which is about some kids living in Compton who get in trouble. I won't ruin the plot for you, but because they're kind of geeky kids, there's all these references to Anonymous or associated groups like LulzSec. They've showed up in TV shows like The Good Wife, like Mr. Robot. They have also been integrated in high art. So this was a ballet in Boston that was based on Anonymous. There was a play in the Royal Court Theatre in London, totally based on Anonymous, that was then picked up in Korea. So there's a couple other examples. But I think this was really important because if they were indeed kind of painted as terrorists, you wouldn't have them lionized in the Royal Court Theatre, right? In all these different places. And again, having them be celebrated in these places also helped to inoculate them. Okay, the next example has to do with ISIS. ISIS was also very present online starting in 2012. And I actually had this argument before Anonymous launched an operation against ISIS. And I just figured the very mere presence of ISIS online helped designate Anonymous as non-terrorists because we had all these, frankly, creepy visual pictures of all these terrorists who also had masks, but they were doing things like beheading people, whereas I think people pictured Anonymous as this, as like some nerdy white kid living at home who was on his computer. And this is a kind of stereotype that's half true and half not true. I think there are a lot of people like this in Anonymous, but there's a lot of people who are not like this. But this stereotype also kind of helped inoculate them against the charge of terrorism, especially when you had these other terrorists who were circulating their content online. And then you actually had Anonymous fight ISIS at a certain point. And this was a weird moment because actually military people got involved in Anonymous, and this just goes back to Marco's point about this being truly a multiple use name. But there was also some very hilarious kind of moments where they were hacking into ISIS Twitter accounts and putting gay porn on them. And that kind of brand of humor that Anonymous is famous for is kind of another reason why it was a little bit harder. Now to finish up, I want to focus in on a single event that I also think was particularly important. And it has to do with a couple of things I've referred to, so this is how I'm going to tie the bow. So back in 2012 in the winter, different countries in Europe, including Poland, were trying to ratify the anti-counterfeit trade agreement. And a lot of people on the internet were not in favor of this trade agreement because it would kind of tighten the screws on intellectual, or give more power to intellectual property holders. And so Poland was actually about to pass this, or accept this trade agreement. And Anonymous decides to engage in an operation against the Polish government, and they did so at the very same time that there were massive street protests in Krakow against ACTA. So this is an announcement by Anonymous. They said, "Welcome to Operation Anti-ACTA. We encourage you to spread the word of anti-ACTA far and wide. The top priority is to steal and leak any classified government information, including emails and documentation. Prime targets are Polish government websites and other high-ranking establishments." And they were engaging in distributed denial of service attacks, which is when you overwhelm a web page with too much traffic and it freezes. So in the midst of Operation Anti-ACTA, this happens. a group of Polish parliamentarians who were against the law took the mask to protest it. This was a really big deal, I think. And it was recognized as a big deal by Anonymous. A participant wrote, "Anonymous is not unanimous. An opinion on distributed denial of service attack is perhaps more divided than any other tactic. Indeed, this very faction, in consultation with anti-ACTA NGOs, has been calling for the halt to the DDoS in the last several days. But after this photo of Polish politicians protesting ACTA went viral yesterday, it's time we all reevaluate the role and legitimacy of DDoS. These parliamentarians were wearing anonymous Guy Fawkes mask while the Parliament's website was down due to DDoS by Anonymous. We can't emphasize that point enough. This is a game changer." And I think it was a game changer because it legitimated not simply the tactics, but the collective as well as the icon. And as far as I know, this is the first time politicians inside the halls of a parliament actually took on the Guy Fawkes mask. And again, they could only do it because it's a mask. I mean, it's kind of a paper cutout, but the idea is that it was a mask. All right, remember that Wall Street Journal article I referred to where Anonymous, it was claimed by the ex-director of the NSA, had the capability of taking down critical infrastructure? Well, that came out just a couple weeks, not even 2 weeks after this protest. And I don't think that's an accident, actually. This is my conspiratorial mind, but I felt like the US government knew that they were losing the propaganda battle over the image of Anonymous, and they basically ceded what was false information to a respectable newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. This was a crucial moment. This is where I got the idea of this paper, because I was sort of sitting going, wow, is this going to be a moment where people are going to believe this story? It is a credible paper. Well, thankfully, a lot of hackers, many who don't like Anonymous, many security researchers, jumped in and sort of said, no, it's ridiculous. They don't have the capability. They don't want to do it because they themselves require electricity to get together online. They're not there to kill people, right? And the story really fell flat on its feet, and Anonymous was fine. Now, I think there's a lot of implications to this story, but I'm not going to let you know what they are. Maybe during the Q&A, I could address them, but that's the story of how Anonymous evaded the terrorism label. Thank you.
Thank you.